Okay, back when you see, while I was a liberal Christian, when many of my theological/ideological distinctives aligned with the purposes of MythVision podcast's content, Derek Lambert was more than happy to host me as an aspiring Christian apologist. Despite our differences then and now, I will always be grateful for the opportunities he provided me over those years. So, Derek, if you and your fans watch this, please know I sincerely don't intend any disrespect or bad faith criticism. As you know, clickbait is the name of the game in YouTube, so don't mind the title or the thumbnail, please. But in any case, your latest video sparked a new research idea that I want to bring to the forefront. So in any case, let's get to your high quality refutation. In this video, Derek argues that the Gospels portray their events under the lens of a quote-unquote third-person omniscient narrator. If the Gospels were strictly eyewitness accounts, how was anyone there to witness the heavenly voices speaking Jesus' temptations, his high priestly prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, or his genealogies? Well, at a cursory glance, it may seem that the Gospels are told by an all-knowing narrator, one who can describe private thoughts and events happening in different places, which often in our modern context signals one thing: fiction. We associate this godlike perspective with a novelist who creates and controls a fictional world. However, this assumption is challenged when we examine ancient texts through the lens of their own historical and literary conventions. The Gospel of Mark, with its direct, authoritative, and seemingly omniscient third-person voice, presents a fascinating puzzle. Is it a product of communal myth-making, or something else entirely? How do we differentiate between the testimony of private events versus a third-person omniscient narrator? This case study will investigate the evidence in light of this insight that Derek has pointed out concerning the so-called third-person omniscient narrator that suggests that the Gospel of Mark is not fiction, but a sophisticated historical account based on eyewitness testimony. We'll be drawing most of our information and insights from Mark Edmund Lung's PhD dissertation, which is for free for public access, pertaining to the narratology of Mark and how it can access private spheres like Jesus' teaching to disciples, yet it's still operating within the category of narration, not this is fictional. We also will be drawing from Pobezin, who argues that in narratology, an ancient historical narrator is typically extradiegetic and heterodiegetic, an external stance that naturally creates a cloak of omniscience. That doesn't mean the author is writing fiction. It's a conventional posture of after-the-fact narration. Pobezin shows that even elite historians like Thucydides and Sallust can shift narrator persona for rhetorical reasons without it being a slip-up. But first, let us take a deeper dive into narrative criticism and how these related concepts can illuminate our understanding of historical reportage. Who's telling the story? Understanding the voices in a narrative. Introduction. The story as a conversation. Have you ever felt that an author was winking at you from behind the page, sharing a private joke or a moral judgment that the characters themselves couldn't see? That wink is what we're here to dissect. Every story you read is a form of communication, a conversation between the real person who wrote it, the author, and the real person who reads it, you. But this conversation isn't as direct as it seems. Between the author in their study and the reader with the book, there's a fascinating cast of quote-unquote invisible characters who shape how the story is told, what it means, and how we're meant to understand it. These roles, the implied author, the narrator, the narratee, and the implied reader, form a communication chain that is the key to unlocking a deeper, more insightful analysis of literature. By understanding who is speaking, to whom, and for what purpose, we move from simply reading a story to truly understanding its construction. 1. The narrative communication chain. Literary theorists view storytelling not just as an art, but as a structured communication model. This model helps us map the journey from the author's mind to the reader's interpretation. At the heart of this journey are 6 key roles spanning from the real world to the self-contained world of the story. The real author creates the story world by making choices about both content, the events, characters, and settings, and discourse, the specific language, rhetoric, and literary techniques used to tell the story. Now let's meet the team that operates outside the direct narration, but shapes its entire purpose, the implied author and the implied reader. 2. The outside team, the conceptual shapers. Pay close attention here. Grasping these next two conceptual roles is the key to unlocking the story's hidden architecture. The implied author and the implied reader are not characters who speak or act in the story, but rather constructs that define the story's purpose and its ideal reception. They represent the guiding vision behind the text and the perfect audience for it. 2.1. The guiding intelligence, the implied author. The implied author is the version of the author that the reader constructs from the text itself. The implied author is a textual construct implied by the text, and the virtual sum of the author's ideological traits. In simpler terms, think of the implied author as a film director. The director's vision, values, and style are present in every shot, in the choice of music, and in the actors' performances, even though the director never appears on screen. This image, as it may be, of the director's intelligence is formed by everything the real author chose to include: the plot, the characters, the rhetoric, and just as importantly, everything they choose to exclude. While the implied author and reader shape the story from the outside, the narrator and narratee are the voices operating from within the act of storytelling itself. 3. The inside team, the voices of the story. The narrator and narratee are the entities directly involved in the telling and hearing of the story within the narrative framework. They are functions within the story world, not outside of it. 3.1. The storyteller, the narrator. The narrator is the voice that tells the story. This is the entity that says once upon a time or I remember when. Wherever there's a narrative, there is a narrator. There's someone or something that has to narrate it, distinguishing the narrator from the implied author. This is perhaps the most challenging yet most rewarding distinction to master that separates a casual reader from a literary analyst. Think of it as the difference between the puppeteer and the puppet that speaks. Literary theorist Gregor Pobezin calls this a sensitive issue because readers are so often inclined to attribute everything a narrator says directly to the real author's beliefs. The implied author is the consciousness behind the entire text, while the narrator is the tool within the text used to tell the story. For example, in The Great Gatsby, the narrator is Nick Carraway who tells the story, but the implied author is the consciousness that chose to tell the story through Nick, shaping our view of Gatsby and the American dream through Nick's specific and sometimes limited perspective. Conclusion: why these distinctions matter. So why does mastering these distinctions matter? Because it moves us from being passive consumers of a story to becoming active participants in the creation of its meaning. It transforms reading from a simple experience into a conscious analysis of artistry and strategy. This framework allows us to see not just what is being told, but how it's being told, by whom and for what purpose, and for which ideal audience. It empowers us to question a narrator's reliability, to uncover the text's hidden moral compass, and to recognize the assumptions a story makes about us, its readers. So, in summary, modern narratological criticism helps clarify that the so-called omniscient narrator is a storytelling posture, a camera that can move anywhere, sometimes even into characters' heads. However, that posture does not, by itself, classify a text as fiction. In the case of at least Mark's Gospel, Mark is the actual author, Peter is the implied author, and the narrator tells the story in the third person, so-called omniscient voice. The dichotomy between eyewitness writing, mapping to first-person diary style, and third-person narration, mapping to invented fiction, is rather naive. In fact, even in modern times, good narrative journalism often writes in third person, reconstructing scenes from interviews with participants, contemporaneous notes, court records, diaries/memories, and multiple independent corroborations. Scholarly overviews of literary/narrative journalism explicitly discuss how story techniques can be used in nonfiction while still requiring source constraints to avoid sliding into novelization. So how does this all apply to the Gospels being eyewitness testimony? Well, as it turns out, even ancient histories and biographies regularly narrate scenes the author did not personally witness, and sometimes narrates motives, deliberations, or private exchanges while still presenting themselves as accounts grounded in sources and testimony. The third-person omniscient voice was a standard tool in the ancient historian's toolkit, used to create a sense of objectivity and authority. This contrasts sharply with the modern concept of an intrusive author-god in a novel. By writing in the third person, an ancient author could present events as established fact, removed from their own personal bias. The ancient writer Lucian of Samosata vividly compares this ideal historian's perspective to that of a Homeric Zeus, who could see all aspects of the action without being a character within it. Two prominent historical figures provide a powerful precedent for this practice. In Xenophon's Anabasis, the historian Xenophon encounters a military expedition in which he was a key participant and eventual leader, yet he chose to write the entire account in the third person, adopting what narratologists call a heterodiegetic persona, a narrator outside the action. This was a deliberate strategic choice. The historian Plutarch later noted that Xenophon even attributed the work to a pseudonym, Themistogenes, specifically in order to be trustworthier when referring to himself, as if to another. This move was designed to present his own actions as objective history, not self-serving memoir. Similarly, Julius Caesar wrote his famous account of the Gallic Wars entirely in the third person. This was a recognized rhetorical technique that allowed him to achieve what ancient readers saw as the authority of the Greek masters, framing his military achievements as unbiased factual reports for posterity. The narrative strategy in Mark mirrors this historiographical convention. The goal is not to invent a fictional world, but to present a historical tradition as reliable and authoritative. The key takeaway is that the narrative voice in Mark is not a claim to divine insight, but a rhetorical performance of historiographical authority. It aligns with the gospel with the established non-fiction writing conventions of its time. Now, let's start applying this to our case examples and determining whether the gospel genres are better interpreted as omniscient fiction or grounded in eyewitness testimony. Objection 1. The genealogies. Genealogies, by nature, source various family records, clan records, public archives, or traditional lists. They're not exactly eyewitness, but they're still grounded in history. Their presence doesn't imply fiction. It implies the author is doing what biographers often do, anchoring identity and legitimacy with recognized ancestral claims. Number 2, the temptations. Jesus was alone. The narrator knows the conversation with Satan, henceforth omniscient fiction. Rebuttal options. Number 1, self-testimony. Jesus could have recounted the experience to disciples. This is the most straightforward access path. Furthermore, Mark gives the bare minimum, while Matthew and Luke expand with structured triads, which is exactly what you'd expect if a remembered event is preached/retold with didactic organization. Objection 3. Gethsemane. The disciples were asleep, so the gospel writers are inventing Jesus' private prayer. Well, first off, asleep doesn't mean absent. The disciples are depicted as repeatedly waking/being roused. The scene can be known in outline from what they did witness. Even if key lines were not overheard, Jesus could have later told them what he prayed and felt, especially since the prayer functions as theological interpretation of the Passion. It was a very important memory that Jesus would have definitely conveyed, either prior to his crucifixion, during his crucifixion, or even after his resurrection. Ancient historians routinely narrate crucial private moments with literary compression, drawing on testimony and interpretive reconstruction. Objection 4. The narrator reads minds, which is fiction. Here's the rebuttal. A lot of the alleged mind reading is actually one of either A, publicly inferable motive language out of envy, fearing the crowd, or B, community memory from participants, including hostile witnesses, later converts, or informants, or C, standard ancient characterization. Historians narrate motives to explain actions. The broader narratology of historiography explicitly discusses the omniscient historiographic narrator as a feature of historical narrative, not a fiction flag. So, in conclusion, third-person narration, even with so-called omniscient defects, is how ancient biography and history often sound. Thucydides, Sallust, and others narrate motives and speeches without being novelists. Luke explicitly claims he investigated events based on eyewitnesses. So the real question isn't third person versus first person, but what access path to the information is plausible. For genealogies, you're dealing with record/traditions. For temptations and Gethsemane, the simplest access path is Jesus himself, his own disclosure, and later apostolic memory shaped for preaching, exactly how testimony behaves. After all, if it is the case that Jesus was a central figure in these ministries, we have to seriously, not a priori, reject the proposition that Jesus would have narrated some of the events he experienced in private. This is not something we can just dismiss out hand. It's something that has to be taken into serious consideration. Narrative style is not a genre detector for fiction.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell for more content. Got questions or ideas? Drop them in the comments below. Until then, next time, thanks for watching. This is Your Boy Paul signing out. Peace.